All right, today is the day, and with this video we're doing another little kind of mini course on FRPs, composites, fiberglass, calling it of course Fiberglass 101, as I've had a lot of people in the comments asking me more about some of the basics of working in FRPs and resins and fibers. So today we're going to be talking about resin themselves, the resin matrix that creates the whole bond of the fibers together, creating our composites. Now there are lots of different resins in the world, and when we say fiberglass, that can mean a lot of things in the fibers, but it also means a lot of things in the resin. And of course, the most popular resins are by far polyester, vinylester, and epoxy. And there are a couple other resins like phenol resin and urethane resins. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about them. I'll just give you a real quick idea of what phenol and urethane resins would be used for. But phenol is a very old resin. You used to see it a lot in a product called Bakelite. Old products way back in the 30s to the 50s and into the 60s a little bit, that were kind of a reddish color, often used in switches and electrical boxes, things like that. Still use phenol a little bit in the world, but it has kind of gone by the wayside, has been taken over by epoxy and fiberglass, especially in like electronics industry. Phenol is good fire resistance and fire and heat resistance, and so they still use it for a few things that need some special application in that area. Urethanes are really not very popular at all, but they are more of a flexible resin if you need to create something that's really extremely flexible. But we're not going to go into those much, just that little brief overview of those. But back to polyester. Now, polyester is probably the most common in the use of building up very large items, molds. If you're interested, or if you're familiar with the kit car world, a lot of the kit cars are just built with a polyester resin and a matte or a spray-in, gunned-in application. Large boat hulls also in polyesters as well. Now there is a variation on polyester, and you can't really tell the difference of the two just by sight or smell or once the product's finished, but that is a vinyl ester. And I'm going to stick with those two just for a moment. Polyester and vinylester, like I said, are very similar, although vinylester has a little bit higher strength qualities. And I find that the price difference, now polyester runs you about $40, $43 a gallon typically, and vinylester is maybe about 10% more than that, or up into the $50 range sometimes for a gallon. But I find that vinylester, with its little bit improved qualities, also has some work qualities that make it work better. And I will only use vinylester from these days forward, as just that price difference is not enough to want to jump back and use something just a little bit cheaper when the qualities are a little bit better in the vinyl ester. Now I say probably the main thing in vinyl ester that has saved me is that it is much better at working on a vertical or an inclined surface. Now with the vinyl and the polyester resins, they work by addition of a hardener. The hardener is called methyl ethyl ketone peroxide, or MEKP, and it is added in small volumes, and a small percentage of this hardener is added to it. The catalyzation takes place and the chemical reaction begins, and they harden up. And we're using vinyl ester and polyester resins. Once you can adjust that cure cycle time by adding more or less MEK, and that will, like I said, adjust your cure cycle. So if you have a colder day, you can add a little more. Warm day, you want to slow down things, you can add a little less. Now when these cycle begins, when the hardener, the MEK, reacts with these resins, they start to get warm as part of this catalyzation process. And when they do, there is a cycle time in there where the heat makes the viscosity thin down a little bit in the ester resins. And if you have a fiberglass up on a flat or a vertical surface, and it goes through that little cycle time where the heat goes on, the viscosity thins down, your fiberglass starts to fall off. I found that to be less so with polyester or the vinyl esters. And so when I'm building molds, which is the only time I use these resins, is almost always with the vinyl ester. Now, since I only use these ester resins in mold making, this is because of the price, of course, and that we're not worried about weight. So we can gain the strength we need in a mold just by adding or throwing as much fiberglass and resin at it as we can to build up a big heavy surface. And then we can, of course, reinforce the backside of the mold with something else. But that price difference in the ester resins makes it worthwhile to go with them for building molds. Now, there are different kinds of categories of these esters and the epoxies in what the resins are used for. So you have tooling resins, which would be used for making molds. Then you have laminating resins when we're building a part. And then there are gel coats. Now, the gel coat is just a resin that has some fillers in it and usually a pigment, making so that you can use that for a specific function. And we're going to go into the gel coat thing later on in this little video, because I have a lot of people asking me about why I'm not using gel coats in building the car itself. Now, a tooling resin can also be used for layup, and it often is when you're building something really big and heavy like a boat hull. This is because it has less shrinkage, and that's why the formulation with this less shrinkage makes it so you can go to big heavy laminates. And of course, we don't want any shrinkage to distort our product when we pull a mold off, so the tooling resin is used there. Otherwise, you're going to go to just a regular laminating resin for most of your projects. Now, one of the things that needs to be known between the epoxies and the polyester is when you're using a fiberglass mat. A lot of people I know like to use a mat to build with because there's no decision between what kind of fiberglass you're going to use, because there's such a vast array of assortments, and which orientation you're going to lay it in to get your strength properties. The mat's just kind of a all-purpose, no decisions, throw it in there and just work it into the part or the mold to get our product in the end. But the mat and some of the fiberglasses have a binder in them that hold the fibers in place. And when you're using epoxy with mat, it is just a real disaster, because the epoxy is so slow at breaking this binder down that you have less work time to really get the mat into position. Whereas the binder is based on a product that is broken down really easy by styrene. And styrene is one of the components of the ester resins. So when you're using a mat and you put the vinyl or the polyester resin on it, it quickly breaks down the binder, and a matte product is able to conform really quickly as it's able to slip and slide those fibers around and get into position. So if you're going to be using a fiberglass mat, you will want to use a polyester or vinylester resin. And of course, if you're using epoxy, you are after weight and strength advantages, and so you're not going to be using a mat anyway. You're going to try to tailor your laminate with specialty fibers. Well, as you can tell, maybe by this conversation and by seeing the projects that we've been working on this channel, that I have a greater preference for using epoxy for most everything I do. And that is because epoxy comes in different formats and formulas that make it much more desirable in the strength and weight factor, and also in its ease of use. Now, epoxy uses a hardener as well, but it is a little bit different in that in the polyesters that use an MEK as a hardener, there's a very small percentage of MEK that's used to catalyze the ester resins. Whereas in epoxy, you're using often like a 3-to-1 ratio, or sometimes even a 2-to-1 ratio. And that makes it a lot easier to measure accurately. We have a set of scales, and you can measure your main amount. You put a certain amount in there, get a measurement on that, and then you can easily do a mathematical formula, times it by 1.33, and that'll give you the ratio for a 3-to-1 mix, and then you can add the hardener until you get to that volume. And you can be fairly safe in having your resins always cure correctly. Now, MEK in the polyester resins is a little bit more forgiving in that it can also be adjusted for, like I said, temperature. If you have a cold day, you can add more hardener. A hot day, you can add less to slow things down. A little more forgiving, but I recommend that you still do an accurate measurement, because there's nothing worse than getting into a project and finding out that it's not going to cure, or be in the middle of doing a lamination and having your resin harden up right on your brush and in your product before the resin even gets into the fibers. But with this, we can also order different hardeners in the epoxy, whereas with the vinyl esters and the polyesters, you are stuck with one type of hardener. Now with the epoxies, you can get usually three different types of hardeners that adjust for the speed. If you want it to be a slow setting resin, which you would really want if you're doing a vacuum infusion, you want time to be able to work around, get things just right, help that resin get through. If you got little pockets that aren't pulling through, to adjust your vacuum bag or something else. Anyway, a slower resin allows it time for you to work with it. And maybe you want a faster resin, you can get a faster hardener. Say you want to just mix up some kind of a bonding agent to bond two laminates together that are already cured. You can get a thicker and a faster resin. Now, when I say thicker, you can also get epoxy resins in different viscosities. Kind of goes towards the same discussion there as the hardener speeds is the viscosity. You want a very thin resin for a vacuum infusion, a thicker resin for doing some bonding. Okay, so I have some notes here, a couple of things I wanted to make sure that I got into this video. And that is some of the benefits of either of these things. And most of the benefits, of course, I'm going to talk to about are the benefits of epoxy. Now, epoxy is much better at penetrating porous surfaces. So if you need to seal something, you have foam, as you've seen us do here. You can seal that foam before you actually put laminations on it. Wooden decks on boats are always done in epoxy, sealed with epoxy, and then a thin layer of fiberglass put over that to make a hard surface. As I mentioned foam, you might know that epoxy is probably the product you're going to go to if you have to put a fiberglass layer on some foam, either on a plug or on a product itself that you're trying to create, as epoxy is very good at not attacking chemically foams. Now, if you try to put polyester or vinyl ester onto some styrene foam, packing foam, or those that you find a cooler made out of, it will pretty rapidly dissolve it away into a gooey mess, whereas epoxy will not do that. And so if you're ever going to use, like I said, foam for building anything, you're going to be going to epoxy anyway. Now, the downfall of epoxy, I guess, is that some people become allergic to contact with epoxy. So if you're using it and you get it on your hands regularly, you may develop an allergic reaction. Now, people very often in the comments tell me, oh, you better be wearing gloves. But somehow when I was young or when I was born, I have this very big problem with having sticky things on my hands. And so over my many years, I have learned to keep sticky things off my hands. And so you can see in my practices that I have developed the skills to use a brush with epoxy and very, very rarely get it on myself. And so I don't, or I should say I don't, but you rarely see me wearing gloves. If I know I've got to get my fingers in there, you will see me with the gloves. I do not have allergic reaction yet. Hopefully that will not come about, because it is a sad day. There have been a lot of airplane kits that people have started to build and then found out that they can't finish it because the allergic reaction is just so bad that it makes their life miserable trying to work in it. Now of course, there is a little bit of the same thing with polyester resin. You certainly don't want to get it on yourself. And I would say that the MEKP is also extremely toxic and can burn your skin if you get that on you. So there is always a problem with working with resins in general. Just use the safety practices, keep yourself covered. Now, other people in the comments also think that they're worried about me and the odor being so bad that how can I work in the shop with that stinky stuff? But actually, the greatest benefit of epoxy over vinyl ester is probably that the polyester vinyl esters are extremely stinky and sometimes overwhelmingly, whereas the epoxies are very, very low odor. Usually right when you start to mix them, they produce little odor, and then after they start to go through the cure cycle, the odor drops off dramatically. These resins that I've been using are really low odor, and so I typically don't even notice it myself when I'm working with them. So now the last thing is another thing that people comment a lot about, and that is gel coats. Why am I not using a gel coat when I'm building the Arete Supercar? Now I will answer that by going across a couple of the reasons why you would use a gel coat. The reason you're going to use a gel coat is to prevent print through, meaning when the resin shrinks up, you can see the pattern of the fiberglass beneath it. And that would be a good reason to use a gel coat. Another reason is that if you want to have a color immediately into your product once you pull it out of the molds, you would put a gel coat in there and do that. And the third reason is that you can also polish or sand on a gel coat and not hit the fibers or go into the fibers and have that kind of frayed surface that you're going to have to finish. So you can take a gel coat and typically go and find a little problem, maybe a bubble. You could add a little more gel coat in there, sand it down, polish it up, and have it done. Okay, so now maybe you're starting to see by the reason you use a gel coat why I do not. First off, in the print through department, I use a layup pattern where I use a super fine fiberglass layers close to the surface that don't produce as much print through. The print through that you see is usually so fine that it's not negligible to the human eye. And the second reason, the coloring in the gel coat, well, let me just say that gel coat colors pretty much suck. They are just usually very unidimensional, opaque colors, often in tooling colors like an orange or a black, maybe a yellow, but just some pretty boring colors. And so since I'm not going to want a boring color on the Arete Supercar or almost anything I do, I want something a little more exciting in the color department. So we're going to just sand, prime, and put a new color on there anyway. So no need for a color in a gel coat. Now there are clear gel coats out there. You can get a coat for epoxy and you can get a gel coat for the polyester, vinylester resins as well. And these are just clear resins with some UV inhibitor in them. But I will also say that these UV inhibitors are not as good as an automotive clear coat. So if you're going to be doing a product that you want to look really nice and you want it to last a long time, I'm just going to recommend that you seal it and coat it with an automotive clear coat in the end anyway. And why you would want a clear gel coat may be defeated by that answer. Well, that is a lot of information if you're new to fiberglass and building FRPs, composites. But let me just say that if you're going to jump into this world and you go and find a distributor of these products, they will have lots and lots of information on their website. They can help you kind of navigate what you're looking for. And it's going to be very dependent on what you're trying to achieve. So we can't answer too many questions until we know what you want to achieve. Now, hopefully you've found a few ideas or little answers to some of the problems that you've had in working with these resins if you have before. But if you're familiar with these products and you've ever found one little trick or a technique or some usefulness with the resins, I would ask you to go ahead and put it in the comments below so that those that are new here, are new into fiberglass, can go in there and learn a few things. Instead of just bloviating on about resins, I'm going to give you a little quick tour of the setup I use and the work area around the resins. And we're going to also jump in, see a little bit of the progress on the Arete, the latest use of epoxy. Let's jump in, take a look. Okay, real quick tour of the work area, or at least the prep area for getting resin ready. Of course, we have here a rack with vacuum bagging materials, a couple of rolls of fibers, cutting surface, and over here, the main thing that is often it is required, is a set of scales, calculator for figuring out ratios, especially in epoxy. Notice here on the wall, I have some already pre-calculated things for gel coats in the polyester or vinylester resins. Some fillers over here in case I need to make a fairing compound or something, all right there at hand. A couple of vacuum pots, reservoirs for vacuum infusion, little pump in the corner there. If I need a smaller amount to mix, I got little small cups, and of course the extras of the Blue Bunny. I use the lids for mixing fairing compounds or Bondo, lots of brushes, and a disposable surface area, because no matter what you do, it seems that a little bit of resin runs down the bottles and the bottom of the bottles gets sticky. And that is our work area. Now this is going to be a little bit of a repeat of things we've seen in the past. Of course, we're going to start off with scuffing their surface layer, taking off any bumps, high spots, and getting down to exposing some fibers for a good bond between these things. And we're going to be doing a 2 layers of biaxial cloth and then 1 layer of a consolidating plain weave that we can squeegee and roller across to get a better surface to finish with. So we have, like I said, 2 layers of biaxial cloth. The first layer going to run to the edge. Second layer is going to lap over and go around the corner, so that when we do like the floor lamination, it will lap over again and build up our strength in the corners where we need it. Now we're going to also run this up and only go up into the wheel well, I should say, the tunnel. Going to go up into the tunnel just to where we hit a straight or vertical surface. We're not going to try to wrap around and do a top surface. Just doesn't seem to work. Getting all these laid out and pressed into place. We'll go around and do a few nip and tucks in some areas just so that we get a nice flow around the corners. Now we've got our fibers in place. We're just going to mix up some resin. Now after our discussion of resin, we're going to have a little discussion of how this goes in. This epoxy is a medium viscosity, and it is got a little bit of a tint in it like we talked about before. I'm changing this thing to blue just so I know where I have got some layers on, what the status of that area is. We're going to put the resin on, and when you first start off, you're just kind of dripping it on, not pushing very hard as the fiberglass can move. But as soon as you got a little puddle built up and it soaks through the resin or it soaks through the fibers, it will start to hold it in place. Then you get a little more aggressive and you start putting resin on. Once you've allowed it to soak a little bit, take your consolidating roller and roll it back and forth, push the air out of it, and you'll see a few of the light spots, little white areas where it needs more resin. Add a little more resin, let that soak in. We'll come back and hit it with a consolidating roller once again. And we're just going to do that all the way down here. Work our way down. Of course, where we have the flap that hangs over the edge, we can put a little resin on the subsurface so that when we stipple with our brush, it will stick and hold it as it goes around that transition at the corner. Now this took about 3 batches of resin. I can usually work, when you're working on a big surface like this, I can usually work between 12 to 17 ounces of resin before it starts to thicken in your pail, and then you want to stop using it or else it won't saturate the resin or the fiberglass properly. It won't soak through because it's just getting too thick to work itself between the fibers. So like I said, work in small batches. If you have a huge lamination going on, got a couple people working on it, it's always good to have one person just mixing resin, keeping everybody supplied, because you only want to work with small batches. Of course, the longer, or it will cure faster when it's in a mass, like in the pot, in your bucket. If you have a big mass in your bucket, it will cure faster. Once it gets spread out onto the resin, it gets thinned into a thinner layer, less heat in the catalyzing action going on, and it cures slower once it's onto the fiberglass area. So of course you want to get it out on there as fast as you can, come back, work it later if you need to. Now once I got this thing fully saturated, there are a couple of places on the high side there where the 2 biaxial cloths were exposed, and I used that plain weave cloth to give a nice finished surface. So I'm going to go back in, cut a couple of strips real quick, and to finish things off, I'm going to add 2 more strips of the plain weave up on that vertical surface to go ahead and make a nice, clean, smooth surface for a finish. Well, there you go. That is a short description of resins and some of their properties. we have more of this little series I'm doing on this Fiberglass 101 course, kind of say, and we'll get into some more technical and how to use some of these products in the future. If you want to see the video on the fiberglass, we will put a little link in the description up here. You can go see that video. And another link over here, just jumping you into the Arete Supercar project, and you can follow that and see a lot of the application of these things we're going to be learning here. Anyway, thanks for stopping by. Come back, see us again.